So let's start with work first. So by definition of work, so I think it's in physics, that will be the force times the distance wherein the force was applied. So force times distance. And um, we can break down the work into two components. So work done by constant force and then work done by a variable force. So let's go first to work done by constant force. So if it's constant force, so meaning there's no changing variable. So meaning every parameter in the formula is fixed. That's why it's called constant force. So meaning the force is fixed, the distance is also fixed. That's why we can solve for the work directly. So one example is, for example, you need to determine the work done in lifting a 50-pound object 4 feet. So notice that the weight is fixed. Also, the direction is also, the distance or the displacement is also fixed. So you can directly use the formula force times distance, and you get the work, which is 200 feet pounds, or 200 foot pounds, or pound foot. So depending on the author. So this one is coming from the book. So it may be pound per foot, pound foot, or it may be foot pound. So depending on how you declare your units. So work done by constant force is super simple, since again every parameter is already fixed, meaning it's not changing. So there's no um, particular integral process that we need to determine, because again every parameter is already fixed. So let's proceed to work done by a variable force. So you may review this one later in the recording, so you may read everything here. But what's important here is that this formula right here. So since we are now in the variable force, meaning variable, meaning the force is changing, or the force may vary from point to point. So for example, at 1 meter, you exert a strong force. Then at 2 meters, you exert lesser force. So muna siyang variable force. So since it's not constant anymore, so this is the time that we're going to use our integral equation. So notice that we have a differential x. So meaning the distance is changing. So since the distance is changing, the force is also varying with respect to the distance, or the displacement in the work being generated. Okay? So it's more likely that this one is still force times distance. But again, since we are now changing our variables, or the force is in the force and distance is changing depending on what position you are in. So that's why we're going to have this one as the formula, f of x, the force being the function of x, and then displacement becomes dx within a certain limit from a to b. So if you're confused on what I just said earlier, just follow the formula lang, basta mo na siya ang formula. Okay, so most likely in the exam, most of the problems that you can encounter in the work problem is more on the Hooke's law. So what I mean by Hooke's law is that most of the problems presented in the final exam regarding the work topic is more on Hooke's law, or in other words, you're going to encounter spring problems. Right? So that's why when we try to remember our physics topics, so there's a topic there wherein you're going to determine the force generated by a spring. So, of course, determining such force coming from the spring, whether it's compressing or expanding or stretching. So there's a formula there wherein we need to determine the spring constant, the K. So this is the formula. Force equals K times the distance. So that's the spring constant. Now the second one is the Newton's law of universal gravitation. So there's also a constant K, but you're going to determine the mass of the objects of the two particles, mass 1 and mass 2, then divide it by d, which is in centimeters. So medyo the distance between the two objects. So most likely wala kayong magawas ani. There's no problem so far that has come out in the final exam. Most likely ang work problems is all about spring problems jud, or lifting problems. But most likely spring is yeah. Alright? So try to focus more on the spring and then also the lifting and pushing problems. Okay, mura na siya ang magawa sa exam. This one is, just introduce this one because, okay, base lang di ba? Na yung magawas. Okay, so I just placed every solution here because, again, if I try to solve it from scratch, probably basin maglisod mo og absorb, because we are used to solving work with a constant force way back in our physics, and at this point we are now solving it with variable force, which is in the integral calculus niya. Murag dili kita ana because again we are used to solving fixed values, diba, for work during our physics subject before. Okay, so let's try to dissect each part here. So a force of 750 pounds so compresses a spring in 3 inches. So from its natural length of 15 inches. So meaning from 15 compressing by 3 inches by a 750 pound force, the length is now 12 inches, right? So find the work done in compressing the spring of an additional 3 inches. So meaning from 15 compressing by 3 inches, then further compressing by another 3 inches, so the remaining length is now 9. Alright? So since this one is a spring problem, so notice that in the figure on the right side, so this is the natural length of the spring. So compressing it by 3 inches with a 750 pound force, so this becomes the spring now. So from 3 to 15, the distance is now 12. Then further compressing by x inches, so the problem is stating that we further compress it with 3 inches. So meaning the remaining length here is 6. So the compression here is 3. The compression total on the last portion is now 6. Alright, so so again, since we are given the force 750 pound force. So we are expected to solve first the spring constant because the spring compressed by 3 inches through the 750 pound force. So with this one, we can solve the spring constant through the formula. Force equals the spring constant times the distance. So this one is 750. So as you can see here. So K is equal to 250. So meaning at any point, or let's say at any distance, the force generated with respect to the spring constant is this formula. So 250x. So regardless of the distance that you're going to compress your spring, so that will be the formula on how much compression you're going to generate. So for example, earlier, so since it's 3 inches, so the force that I'm going to generate compressing 3 inches is 750 pound force. So kung 4 inches, so 4 times 250. If 5, so on and so forth. So muna siyang ito ang atong ma-generate na force. So the work, again, since we are making it a variable force, because again, we are determining it with distance. So that will be force times the distance increment. So the force is this portion here. And the distance increment is dx or delta x because again, we still need to determine the compression from the natural length. Okay, so since the problem is asking for an additional compression of 3 inches, so that's why our limits of integration is from 3 to 6 inches. So using the formula, so you now have this equation here. All right. So take note that so you can just plug in this equation in the calculator. So once you establish this one in your exam, so you may use your calculator directly to get the answer, which is 3,375 pounds. So that will be from, so I'll give you the full credit if you place the correct answer also. So correct equation and then correct answer. So take note that you do not integrate from 0 to 6 because you're only asked to determine the work done in compressing the spring at an additional 3 inches. So not including the first one, diba? So take note the term here. Find the work done in compressing the spring of an additional 3 inches. Right? So medyo libog siya. So just try to so ako lang siyang gi-complete og kuan og detailed sa pagsuwat dire because para inyo siyang ma-review later sa recording. Okay, medyo again, it's difficult to absorb the application topics sa work and liquid pressure because kuan siya kanang daghan siya og kanang you need to look over stuff pa before you can integrate the equation. Joules here if kuan you're going to use joules for the J unit if it's in metric system. So since this one is English system, so pound inch or pound force yang unit. All right. So let's try another problem. So this time it's the lifting problem. So in lifting problem, so a 20-foot chain weighing 5 pounds per foot is lying coiled on the ground. So meaning this one is the 20-foot chain, and the weight of it is 5 pounds per foot. So meaning if we multiply this one with the 20-foot distance of the chain, this will give you 100 pounds for the length of your chain. So meaning if it's fully extended. All right. So how much work is required to raise one end of the chain to a height of 20 feet so that it is fully extended as shown in the figure? So meaning this one is the 20. So meaning y is 20. All right. So of course we don't want to directly solve it using force times distance. So don't try to look at that way that your y is already 20 feet, because ato lang siyang imagine that if you're trying to lift an object higher and higher, so you are trying to push it against gravity, diba? So meaning you need to exert a lot more effort compared to the initial lifting process. Diba? So since you are fighting against gravity, so na siya ang kuan ang inyong i-think nga murag as you go higher, tend to generate more force compared to the initial lifting process, diba? Since you are fighting gravity. So the weight of each section is the increment force. So meaning the weight is 5 pounds per foot that is coming from the problem. So again, we don't multiply it directly with 20 because again, the length is changing, diba? From 0 going towards 20. And again, if you try to put in the concept of lifting, so as you go higher, so it will generate a lot of effort and a lot of force going towards a higher distance. So that's why it's just length, or dy, or delta y. So that's why the formula for the force is 5 delta y. Okay, so the increment of the force, I mean the work, so again, we're coming from force times distance. So that will be this one. The increment is 5 delta y. Then the distance is y. Because you need to, so the distance is not dy or delta y, because according to the problem, you need to raise it to a height of 20 feet, fully extended. So we just place the delta y in the delta f, because again, the weight of the chain is 5 pounds per foot. So medyo libog siya, no? So muna akong pasabot na murag kailangan pa na siya kanang hinugtukan, na kailangan pa ninyo i-stare at for a couple of times para inyo masabtan ng ano inana na siya nga kuan. So delta w is equal to 5y delta y. Or if you don't want to understand this portion here, so just try to use the formula directly. So force with the function of x. So instead of x, we're going to make it in terms of y. So a to b f of y dy. So the force is 5 times the distance and then dy. Yan na, di ba? So pwede po na siya. Then from 0 to 20. Now, if you don't want to understand this portion here, so you may directly use the formula and then plug in the the force, the function of x of the force. So in this case, it's function of y because we are lifting vertically. Then you put the limits of integration from 0 to 20. So pwede po siya asad if you don't want to understand the process on how we got the formula here, right here. So bali ang kaniyang i-present is detailed derivation of the formula. But if you don't want to go very detailed, so you can just use this one. All right, so let's try to go to the next example. So kanisha, it's a difficult problem. So emptying a tank oil. So a spherical tank of radius 8 is half full of oil that weighs 50 pounds per cubic foot. Find the work required to pump oil out through a hole in the top of the tank. So meaning the oil is going out here at the top of the sphere. Okay, so take note that the weight is pound per cubic foot. So meaning this one is force per volume, di ba? So you need to multiply this one with a certain volume for you to be able to determine the total force. So if you don't know the volume of the sphere, di ba, kay ang atuang problem is about the sphere. So you need to determine the volume of the sphere. All right. So the problem here is we're going to determine the thickness of the disc because again, since we are pumping it out portion by portion and it's not totally a sphere when we determine the volume, and take note that the sphere, the oil is only half full in the container or in the tank. So meaning we need to represent your volume with a disc. Baka itong method of disc. So one portion here. But then rotating it 360 degrees, so you'll be generating a horizontal disc. So that's why the the volume here is pi r squared times the thickness delta y. Yeah, kani mo sampo siya kalibog because you're going to need the equation of the circle. And if you don't know how to generate the equation of the circle, so kana medyo it's a big problem jud. So if you don't have analytic geometry way back in your senior high, so the basic formula for the circle is x minus h squared plus y minus k squared is equal to r squared. Ano? So medyo labad-labad yun na siya nga kuan. So sige lang, if magawas ni sa exam, yan, wala mo naka-answeran eh. So kana ako lang siguro na siyang i-plus points sa katong pag-vote ninyo. But sure ko din siya magawas because ang magawas most likely is katong lifting and katong inyong spring problem. Alright, so di lang ako tiwason kay medyo sure ko nagsunggo na mo diha. Daghang pa kita og kailangan determine dire para makakuha mo sa answer. Muna siya ang continuation, medyo labad-labad na kayo siya. Okay, so for the problem set for the work is that I'm not going to give it to you. So just try to review the the problem set for the work. So ako ihatag ang link so para inyong ma-review with the solution. So let's go to the fluid pressure and fluid force. So the pressure is so the water pressure is determined by WH, W being the density of the liquid. So most likely what you will encounter later on is the density of water. So this becomes, in other terms or other formula, this becomes the pressure is equal to gamma water times the height. So the force exerted by a liquid against a submerged vertical plane region is equal to this formula. So this one is the unit weight of water or density of water. And take note that this one, this HY/LY/dy is the volume of the submerged plane region. So height, width, thickness. Height, length, and width or thickness. So that will be the unit weight of water times the volume for you to have the force. So for us to understand this topic even further is that we're going to have this example. So a fluid force on a vertical surface. So a vertical gate in a dam has the shape of an isosceles trapezoid. So as seen here in the figure, with dimensions of 8 and 6 feet as the base, and then 5 feet as the height of that isosceles trapezoid. Okay, so what is the fluid force on the gate when the top of the gate is 4 feet below the surface of the water? So if this is the submerged gate, so the water level is 4 feet above the trapezoid gate or the trapezoid isosceles trapezoid vertical gate. So since we are going downwards, so our distance going towards the force that we need to create is negative y. So that's why h of y is equal to negative y because we are going towards this portion here, negative y distance going down. So you can see it here in the figure, hy is negative y. So to find the length of the region at y is that we're going to be creating an equation. So another labad sa ulo because you're going to create an equation of the line here. So of course, you're going to create a horizontal strip. So let's say this one is our horizontal strip. And again, you're going to need the knowledge of analytic geometry for you to be able to create the equation of the line, because the horizontal strip is touching this portion here. And since you don't have any equation for this line here, so ang problema na is you're going to create your own equation using the knowledge coming from analytic geometry. So this one is coming from your 2-point form of the line, 2-point form, or you may also use the point slope form, or basta daghan kayo siya mga form sa line, di ba? Or equation sa line. So daghan kayo na siya nga pwede niyo magamit. Basta as long as you're using the equation of the line to generate the equation. So again, the purpose of finding the equation of the line is that your horizontal strip is touching the right side of the equation. And for us to determine the length of this vertical line, I mean horizontal line, is since this one is touching this portion here, so notice that this one is distance x going towards the right. So murag ang inyong pag-determine ani is this one is probably your x right. X left in your strip is 0. So you can just multiply it by 2 because since your gate is identical or symmetrical. So again, this whole process here is 2-point form, meaning the problem or the author was able to generate the equation of the line using 2 points. This point here, 4 and -4, and then 3 and -9. So the equation of the line with respect to x is y plus 24 over 5. That's the equation of the line on the right side. So continuation, so again, as you can see here, twice the length coming from the previous slide. So that will be your L of y. And then dy is the thickness of, so dy is the thickness of the horizontal strip. So you have the depth, you have the length, then you have the thickness of the horizontal strip. So that's why by equation, h of y, L of y, dy is that you have negative y, 2/5 of y plus 24, and then dy. So for the density of liquid or unit weight of liquid, so I'm going to write it here. So gamma W or W in English system, the standard or the constant value for the density of water is 62.4 pound per cubic foot. In metric system, that will be 9.81 kilonewton per cubic meter or 9,810 newton per cubic meter. Or in kilograms, this one is 1,000 kilograms per cubic meter, or in grams, that is 1 gram per cubic centimeter. So daghang kayo no? So muna siya murag makasabot ra ko most likely sa akong students before. Dili kay sila ka-answer ani because daghan na kay remember. Nya murag difficult kay siya i-absorb labi na kani nga topic. Okay, it's a major in civil engineering. So fluid mechanics ang kani nga tuan. Fluid mechanics ang kani nga subject. So sure ko wa jud may question ani kay libog jud siya. Okay, so another problem. Another problem nga maglibog na sad ta. So this time our gate is not a trapezoid anymore, but we're going to be dealing with a circular gate. So again, since we are going downwards, so our height is 8 minus y. So most likely magdepende na siya where you're going to place your X and Y origin. So this time, ang iyang pag-place sa iyang origin is at the circle. So that's why it's 8 minus y ang distance going towards the surface of the water. So earlier, our X and Y origin is at the surface of the water. So that's why going towards the bottom part of the differential strip is that it's negative y only because it's coming from 0. That's why it's negative y. So dire, our origin is at the center of the circle. So moving towards the vertical surface of the water, that's 8 units. So going downwards, that will be 8 minus y units going towards the differential strip. So delta y. So most likely our variable of integration here in the fluid pressure is all in y because puro siya going downwards, diba? Fluid pressure. So the pressure is changing as you go downwards, diba? So marasag. So I think kung mag-swimming mo sa dagat or sa swimming pool, diba? Magkalaw mo kay magkasakit ang dunggan. So increasing pressure, diba? So most likely our variable of integration here is in terms of y. So for the length, you can just analyze half of the strip. So this is x left is 0, x right is the equation of the circle. So muna, if you don't know how to generate the equation of the circle, which is this one, so di ka po makasolve sa problem. You need to determine the equation of the circle for you to be able to determine the length. So again, it's 2 times x because you are just analyzing half of the strip. So to make the strip whole, so you multiply it by 2 to create the longer version because again, as you can see here, x is just half of the strip. So to make it complete, so we're going to multiply it by 2. So again, it's 2 times the square root of 1 minus y squared because isolating x, this becomes x squared equals 1 minus y squared. Then getting the square root, you have the square root of 1 minus y squared. So again, the purpose also of this one being the equation because since the center is at 0, 0, so if we try to determine the basic functions of the equation, r squared, so the origin is at the center, so meaning this one is 0, so x squared plus y squared, and then the radius, notice that it's 1 unit, so 1 squared. So that's why this one is the equation. Okay, then you're going to have this equation here. So the y range is from -1 to 1 because that is what is only covering the circular gate from -1 going towards 1. So that's why it's from -1 to 1. And then this is the answer. Alright, so this is the problem set. So I'm just going to give you the link for you to be able to review the problems presented. So with solution na siya, I'm just going to kuan lang. I'm going to publish it in kuan lang, in Canvas. Alright, so I'm sure that there's no question because again, super libog jud kay ang topic. And then, pwede rin siya i-calculator dito as long as your equation is correct. So of course, I think sa pag-graph pa lang daan, medyo lisod na kay ang pag-declare pa lang daan sa positioning sa inyong origin sa inyong equation is medyo lisod na. So muna makasabot ra jud ko nga dili kay mo ka-answer ani if ever na ay magawa sa exam. So it may be that I'm going to omit it or I'm going to akong pag-omit is muna siya ang plus points sa pagkuha niyo sa pag-vote ni Friday.